Caroline. I wanted today to bring you another perspective. We've been highlighting and talking with a lot of women in the expat realm, women who have decided to go off and start a new life. But I wanted today to talk with and share a really unique story with you of a Black man who happened to expat away from his home country. And now he has a very interesting life and a very interesting story that I'm anxious to share with you. Welcome, Asher Ruben Ford. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us. So, Asher,
Thanks for having me.
my pleasure. So, where are you from originally?
I grew up in Baltimore, more or less. Yeah, I'm from Baltimore. Yeah, Baltimore.
So, were you a traveler growing up? Did you like travel, or was your expat adventure just okay? I'm out. Peace out.
I understand. Interesting enough, no, actually, so I live in Israel. So when I came to Israel in 2009, it was the first time I had ever left the United States. Um, yeah, it was my first trip abroad. Interesting enough, however, years after living here, it was a very difficult thing for my family, particularly my mother, to accept. But in a conversation with my mother, I recalled that she recalled when I was very young, I would say probably fifth grade, sixth grade, she had noticed I started receiving mail. This was years ago. I'm 37. Anyway, I started receiving mail, and what happened was I used to call airlines, and I would make these trips. I don't know, whatever. I was a kid, and I had a fantasy about traveling, and I would just call airlines, and I would go through the whole thing and write down my reservation number. And then when they would get to the point where they would ask to pay, I would say, oh, I have to call you back. I'll look for my credit card or something like this. And I'm not exaggerating when I say I was in fifth or sixth grade when this happened. And I'd completely forgotten about this until my mother brought it up. So although Israel was the first country I traveled to, I like to believe that I always fantasized about traveling as a young kid. So whatever, yeah. And since then I've become a traveler, and I travel often. We travel about 3 or 4 times a year outside the country. So we've been everywhere.
So, do you speak Hebrew?
I do. So I'm married, and my husband, his first language is Russian. He was actually born in the former Soviet Union, which is today, where he was born is today Uzbekistan. So his first language is Russian. And so we share Hebrew as the language we speak at home, as the language between the two of us. Um, and yeah, I wouldn't say I'm pretty fluent. Yeah, I speak Hebrew. I struggle still, obviously, 10 years in, but yeah, I speak Hebrew.
Wow, so that's really interesting. Your husband's Russian. You're living in Israel. Wow, how did you meet?
So so in Judaism, there's this idea of a shidduch. It's like a matchmaker, someone who sets you up. So we had a mutual friend who actually had a dream about the two of us. And one day, about 6 years ago, Dima, my husband, called, and I remember I answered the phone, and he was speaking Hebrew to me and very rapidly. And I remember saying to him, like, no, I think you have the wrong number. And he kept saying, no, 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 I'm calling the right person. And finally, in English, in this very thick Russian accent, he says, do you know what is shudder? Like, do you know what is a match? I said, yeah. He's like, this is shudder. So I realized that we'd been matched by a friend, and we went on our first date a few weeks later. And the rest sort of just worked out.
The rest is history. Wow, that's
Yeah.
really interesting. What is it? What has it been like for your family? I know you mentioned in the beginning it was difficult for your mom for you leaving. I
Yeah.
mean, you have a lot of different elements going on. You're gay. You're moving to a country that most Black Americans don't have on their list of places to move to. How
for
was
sure.
that for your family?
Um, so it's twofold. So first it was Judaism, the conversion to Judaism, which was, I would say, a bit of a challenge. I grew up in a Pentecostal home, so this definitely had its own elements. And then the moving to Israel was something else. My mother, thank God, she's come around. She came for the first time in 2018, so a few years ago, and she stayed with us, and she had a wonderful trip, and she really, she loved Israel. She fell in love with the country, and she loves my husband. We weren't married at the time, but yeah, she loves my husband and my in-laws, and it's worked out really well. Thank God.
Wow. So what kind of an adjustment was it? I am pretty familiar, like not the Jews from Israel, but I do know a little bit from working in New York and being around them a lot, but it's certainly not the same, I'm going to say, as actually living in Israel. It's probably a little bit different vibe. What was the adjustment like for you, moving from Maryland to a totally 360-degree culture?
Yeah, for sure. Um, so I mean, I had practiced Judaism for a period of time in the US, so I sort of was at least familiar with Jewish culture. So that was an easy transition. It's important for me to say that I didn't intend to come to Israel as an expat. I came originally as a student for 1 year. I did a postgraduate program in yeshiva just outside of Jerusalem. And it was only after my first complete year here that I decided to what we call make aliyah, to become a citizen. And so yeah, the process, I mean, I feel like it's still going on. Like I don't think it's finished yet. I, in many ways, my identity feels confusing because I'm not ever going to be fully Israeli. I have an Israeli passport. I speak Hebrew. Well, thank God, my husband and I own our home. But I'm never going to be fully Israeli. And yet, I no longer feel fully American either, if that makes sense, particularly when I travel back. I feel very much like foreigner experiencing the US. So yeah, the adjustment, it's still going on. I'll
So
let you
that's
know.
interesting. How welcoming are the Israelis to foreigners?
Ah, so it's funny. So in Hebrew, what you call a native Israeli, someone born here, you call them a sabra. A sabra is the Hebrew word for a cactus, which I think is perfect for an Israeli. It describes them. So on the outside, they're very rough and prickly, and they might even hurt a bit. But once you cut through that thin layer, you have a warm, very welcoming presence. So I love Israelis. Obviously, I love living here. I can understand someone, for example, who would look at Israeli culture as abrasive. It's true. It's very direct. But Israelis, once you get, like I said, beyond that thin layer of the initial abrasiveness, yeah, they're very warm and welcoming, and they'll go out of their way to make you feel a part.
That's interesting. Have you gotten any feedback living there, being a Black man, from the recent events going on in the US? What is the feedback like?
So this is a more of a difficult question, I'll be honest. Look, I I think many of us probably abroad looking at the US now, it feels uncomfortable watching. Do you know, when we're dealing with people outside of our culture who have their opinions or think they understand what's going on, and sort of having to be the ambassador or explaining what Black culture is or answering questions. I've had a mixture of both. I've had very supportive friends and people who are all the way, and I've had people who definitely take exception to what they call rioting or looting, and when I try to sort of to shape their question, to explain, like you have to put a historic context on it. It can be challenging. I will say just tonight though, it's very nice. My husband came to me and he said, you know, I want to apologize if I've ever said anything or that offended you, or I wasn't sensitive to your culture, or I didn't understand it. I said, no, you've never. And I love it because although he is white, whatever, you know, he's white, he grew up Russia, he's Russian, he doesn't have the stain of American racism in him. Like he doesn't understand what the experience of people of color have been in North America, or the Americas for that matter. So yeah, so for sure what's happening is difficult. And also, if I can be honest, and it's quite raw, I've also sort of questioned myself. Like you know, the question of, am I a sellout? Am I selling out by being here? Am I, you know, actively supporting my people? Is definitely crossed my mind, and it's hard for me. And yeah, yeah, for sure. I'm not a sellout. I just want to point that out. But the idea that I might have sold out has crossed my mind.
That's interesting. Okay, well, what advice? Now you've been abroad. How many years have you lived there now?
September will be 11.
Okay, so you've been out enough time where you're a pretty seasoned expat. Any chance that there are any regrets? Any chance that you may decide to go back to the U.S. or have you pretty much found your home?
No, I'm pretty firm. I mean, obviously, I don't. If you would have told me even 3 or 4 weeks before I came to Israel that I would be here, I wouldn't have accepted it. I wouldn't have believed you. So anything is possible. But as it stands now, I don't. I always tell people I see myself in Israel for the next 7 to 10 years, and I've been saying that ever since I got here. So I don't see myself going back. I'm married. You know, I live here. I've been with my organization where I work for almost 8 years. Yeah, like this is my life. Obviously, I'm an only child, so the question of eventually what will happen with my mother, and the need to, you know, that type of thing, of being an asset to my mother as she ages, has crossed my mind. And I don't have an answer for that yet. Thank God I don't need to answer it for a very long time, God willing. But yeah, as far as advice is coming to either living abroad, or I would say that, like, you oftentimes I find that Americans, not just African Americans, but Americans in general, have a perception of what foreign countries are, or what other countries are. Like, I remember when I landed in Israel and I had a friend and her husband picked me up at the airport, and I feel like such an idiot admitting this, but we were driving along the highway from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and I remember saying, like, oh, you guys have streetlights here. Like, and I mean, it's this, like, you know, very naive thing. But I definitely recommend for everyone, especially Black Americans, to travel as much as possible, go in with an open mind. And also, even if someone says something to you that initially comes across as abrasive, or maybe even be interpreted as racist, take the time to really engage and to understand where they're coming from. Oftentimes people aren't actually racist, they just have never encountered someone different from themselves, and they need that person to just speak with them and to say, like, no, that's not exactly how it is, or explain whatever questions they might have, or just prove them wrong. Don't play into whatever stereotype they may have. And that's all that I can do for myself and in my own mental health, forward.
That is so true. I'm in Mexico, and many people do have the perception of anyone that has a U.S. passport as being someone wealthy. And a lot of it is just due to the fact, like you said, they don't know. They just assume that if you live in the U.S., even if you come from the slums of, South wherever, that you're rich.
Yeah.
And just the fact that you left your country to go to another country, to them, it's like, wow, that's a monumental event. So I totally get that. Well, I'm just really, again, thankful for you sharing a little bit of your story. And, we cut it down into just a few minutes. I'm sure there's so much more in between. But and you did give a little bit of advice. Any thoughts to, uh, I guess maybe if we took it to another level, being gay in the U.S. and moving abroad, do you have advice specifically for people who are gay who may feel, oh, well, because there are many countries that do have certain laws and reservations about that community. Do you
Yeah.
have any advice for folks in that community, as far as them planning or thinking about moving abroad?
Sure. For sure, when it comes to the gay community or the LGBTQ community in Israel, there might be a perception because Israel is a religious country and it's politically conservative that it might not be a welcoming country. That is completely false. Israel is probably the most gay-friendly country in, for sure, in all of the Middle East and possibly in all of Asia. Tel Aviv has the second largest gay pride in the world. So yeah, for sure, as far as Israel is concerned, gays and lesbians feel welcome. You can, if you don't believe what I'm saying, you can look it up yourself. You'll see that, yeah, I mean, Israel is a very progressive society. My husband and I are legally married. If you want to get into the question of the legality and how it works, we can, but we are legally married here in Israel. Um, but yeah, I would say the same with any community. Travel as much as you can, experience as much as you can, and be an example for your community, an ambassador for your community in a positive way.
Thank you so much, Asher, for sharing your story with us. Hope it will bring a lot of hope and inspiration to those that are thinking, the many that are thinking of taking that leap now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Shalom.
Shalom.